Just to let all the participants aware of how this evening is going to pan out. Firstly, we are going to very briefly introduce the Heavy Water Collective, and then Anthony, who is present with us, hi Anthony, is going to introduce us to G39 and his work. And Pete will do the same with regard to Kunslterhaüs Dortmund. So thank you, all of you, for being here. We are also awaiting Sara Huws, who might be joining us. Sara was the special person who helped us find so many wonderful treasure in the special collection at Cardiff University. So this evening is very much for us to talk to us about the collective Heavy Water, and more specifically about the work that we've conducted during our residency at G39 and the participation of Kunstlerhaus Dortmund in this project. The presentation will last roughly an hour, and there will be half an hour at the end of this session to ask some questions. For ease of use, please type your question in the chat, and we will monitor those questions, and we will phrase the questions for you, and we will try to answer them. So onto this, please, Vic, share your screen with us, and we're going to start the presentation. Thank you. And I think, Vic, you can unmute yourself without me.
Yep. Okay. So yeah, I will just go through the presentation. Here we go. So yeah, we're the Heavy Water Collective. We're an artist collective that draws from archives and collections to create artworks that reclaim narratives in a contemporary context. And our project manifests through research collaborations, exhibitions, and public programme with selected archives, collections, museums, and galleries. And that's how we've ended up working with G39 and also Kunstlerhaüs Dortmund. Our collective takes its name from a form of water with a unique atomic structure that is often used for the stabilisation of volatile matter. Its materiality is mystical, permeating organic bodies, calming violent creations, grounding and giving weight to something fluid and intangible. Heavy water is representative of the processes of investigation and methods of making that we as artists have developed in response to shared subject matter.
And Vic, I'm really sorry, I was a very bad host, because I think that perhaps I should have let Anthony and Pete introduce themselves first.
I've stopped sharing. Okay. Let's go.
Anthony, would you like to tell us a little bit more about G39 and yeah, anything else you want to share with us?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Anthony Shapland. I'm the creative director at G39 and one of the founders. I'll talk more about it in a while, about what G39 is and how it exists, but it's an artist-run space in Cardiff in Wales. We're coming up to 25 years in the running, which in artist-run years, like dog years, is forever. And I was just happy to host the group in the hottest summer we've had in Wales for a long time in July. Yeah, passing over to Pete.
Thank you. So I won't make use of my slides, like 12 slides I prepared, because it's too long, I think. Let me short say about Kunstlerhaüs Dortmund is now 40 years old artist-run initiative with studios and exhibitions, projects, and cultural education as well, and residencies, not to forget. So these are the main working spaces we serve. And so that's the reason why I think, especially because of the residency part of it, we were asked to maybe take part in the discussion around that, what Heavy Water does. And besides that, I'm an art historian, and maybe could say one or another word concerning the work itself, which was presented, thankfully, by the three artists to me in the meantime. So this was a very fruitful cooperation, I thought. Especially, but we will talk about outcome, maybe a potential outcome of that later on, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. And so I guess now we can go back to the presentation. Thanks, Vic.
Maud, can I cut my bit quite short, but I'll say more later on about G39.
Brilliant. We look forward to that.
Sorry, are we waiting on me?
No,
Okay.
I think we're waiting on Vic. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I hope I can speed up this moving through slides business. Okay, I think Joe, this is your slide.
This is mine. I'm just going to quickly talk about how we got together. So that previous slide was a show that we worked together with Freelands Foundation at Site Gallery. And we were part of a program where we were put together in that show. But as we curated it and worked together, we realized there was a large number of crossovers in our work, not only the kind of approaches and the underlying themes, but in the way that we make work, which is kind of highly detailed and layered, but in very different ways and different approaches. And we felt themes emerging and arising. So from that, we went on to form the collective and did a number of events. The G39 residency was a brilliant kind of first start of our first collaborative project. We went on to do this from these images are from the cemetery in Sheffield, the General Cemetery, kind of really amassed with history. So we had a residency there looking at the geology, looking at the history, and really forming new ways of communicating and talking. And we did a presentation there and have made some work from there as well, but we won't be showing them tonight as we'll be focusing on this particular project. But we have ongoing projects and communications, and it's an ongoing concern in our practices.
And this is an image of the special collections at Cardiff University. It's a wonderful brutalist building, and it's where we spent a lot of time during our residency, this summer residency at G39. So we were working both at the special collections, where we were looking at archival materials, and we were then taking those research to, thanks Vic, beautiful transition. We were then taking this research material to G39, and those three images really highlights what a wonderful and conducive place to work G39 was for us. As Anthony mentioned it earlier, it was the most beautiful summer ever, so we had very regular lunch outside. So the residency was for us a way to develop our work with archive, our collaborative work, but it was also a place to work, an elsewhere place to work, which was also very conducive to making new work. And it was also a place where to start a conversation with other artists at G39. So those images, I hope, document this. We can move on to the next slide, please.
Okay, so we're the three of us are going to each introduce the artifacts and sort of research that we were each engaging with on the residency first. So the printed items that I selected to view included historical accounts of witchcraft and witch hunting, childbirth, midwifery, and colonialist exploration. And because of their original context, all of these historical accounts have been written by and for men in positions of power, which is unsurprising and expected. But what was most striking to me was that that women were absolutely central in the majority of these texts that I encountered. So for me, these books hold a charged energy through their objecthood, through the stories that they contain and through the voices that they exclude. During my time in the archive, I became drawn to a series of material descriptions present in some of the objects that I encountered. So in Evidence Concerning Witches and Apparitions, which is the book on the right there, a ghostly form bleeds out of the materiality of the page in the form of a thick band of lace. And it's likely that the lace was used as a bookmark for a considerable amount of time, so that the pattern, its knots and netting, seeped into the fibres of the surrounding pages to leave a phantom trace. The image appears as a subversion in the context of this book, so it becomes a kind of witch's mark against the diatribe that the book promotes. And I'll talk a little bit about witch's marks later on. Another beautiful intervention is in the form of a network of delicate tunnels, which is the middle image there. And it's a book entitled Wonderful Prodigies of Judgment and Mercy. And it's the tunnels have been made by a bookworm, possibly centuries ago. And these small openings, for me, rendered an unintentional edit, as absences eradicate violence, underline power, and punctuate rhetoric. And this is another little intervention. So there's a hole in this page, and the book is Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft. And the hole was presumably made in order to obtain the charm, which is what's missing. And it's a charm that's needed to know of treasures buried in the earth. So I really liked this relationship between the act of digging and having this hole in this kind of artifact. And in the context of a book that collates cruel histories relating to the miserable ends of witches, conjurers, and strange apparitions, you would expect that the reader would have aligned themselves with divine goodness rather than with witchcraft. And I think that makes this absence an intriguingly subversive action. Yeah, really sort of taken with that. Going back to G39, so those are the artifacts that I came across in the archives, and then I took those images back to G39 and responded directly to them, and others as well. So having found the lace imprint, which I interpreted as this subversive witch's mark in the context of the book, I began researching witches' ladders. And witches' ladders are still practiced in pagan communities as a tool for meditation and ritual, and involve binding positive wishes into an entanglement of threads and objects through systematic knotting. And that's much like lace. So there's a really nice sort of relationship between the two things. Yeah, the practice summons the human will to hope, desire, and or protect things that are cared about deeply. And I've developed this artifact based on some instructions I found online on how to make a witch's ladder. And I carved these 9 talisman whilst I was there at G39 out of soap. And each of the objects is kind of inspired by something that I found in the archive. And then I constructed this ladder using the knotting technique. In addition to the ladder, I also developed a series of experimental collages using cutting and scanning techniques. And in this body of artistic research, the categories of witch, native, commons, minerals, uterus, and non-human are all brought together as sites of extraction under capitalism. Pass on to Jo.
Just unmuting. Me and Vic are in a studio right next door to each other, so we're trying to be very strict on the muting and unmuting. So I was looking at the wonderful prodigies of judgment and mercy, which was the book I selected. And then it's funny that it crossed over between mine and Vic's research, which was a really kind of beautiful thing that was happening. I was really interested in approaching the archive, thinking about the Reformation, that period, as I was working with an archaeologist from Sheffield at the time on funerary practice and looking at how the Reformation changed funerary practices and these politics of above and below ground. So that was something I kind of carried on in this archive. So in this text, I was looking at this alongside John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and this text that talks about this spiritual journey, but in a very descriptive and precise way and in a very political way. So this was something I was looking at. Next slide, please, Vic. And again, I chose the time for the residency to draw. As a painter, I make really detailed paintings and they take a long time. So I end up working on them for a long time and leaving little time for drawing practice. Also, when I approach archives, I've tended in the past to work with ceramics and think about artifact making, but it's a real kind of development in my practice as a painter and as someone that uses drawing to start to use that as a way of engaging and evolving and taking the time to draw. So this is just some beautiful illustrations from the illustrations of British goblins, which I was using to create new work and new drawings. Next slide, please. At the same time, I'd kind of have always had this kind of interest in war, and as a landscape painter, war is something that has inspired an understanding of trying to understand the landscape and the impact on landscape from war. So this is a really beautiful book of poems by Richard Adlington with illustrations by Paul Nash. And they're beautiful prints, but it's this idea of a kind of an untunneling of the earth, a break in the earth. And I was looking at this alongside these kind of Reformation texts in which all of a sudden you have this world, this split where the world bifurcates and you have Catholicism and Protestantism. And then in war, there's an analogous thing, this division, and the earth divides. So I was looking in landscape terms of this fissure, this cleavage and this cleave within the earth. So they were kind of interesting sources to start to look at when I arrived at Special Collections. Next slide, please, Vic. At the same time, so there was a collection of illustrated magazine from the First World War. And I was looking at image upon image of destruction and these kind of really close-up images of conflict and war and the strange things that happen to the landscape and the environment, and being published at the same time with these theosophical kind of glossy magazines of spirituality, this kind of cloying Bibby's Annual, and this kind of way of translating this experience of war into this kind of dewy-eyed spirituality, which was a really strange contrast. And these thought forms you can see on the bottom left there of this spiritual burgeoning, which kind of annihilates or kind of moves away from those real brutalities. Thank you. Next slide, please. And then that's Maud.
Hi, so Sara, who was our main point of contact at the Special Collection, had asked us before our arrival to select some items for looking at the catalogue. And I didn't know what to choose. I mean, there were so many items and artifacts that I could have chosen that I was a bit lost for choice. But very quickly in my research process, I realized that I wanted to work with letters. So I was very undiscriminatory at first with the type of letters that I wanted to look at. So some were romantic letters, some were spiritual letters, any kinds of letters were of interest to me. And the reason why it's because I think letters have a huge narrative potential, and I often use narrative as a starting point for work. But what also interested me is that letters are narratives that are narrative. They are not the narrative written by historians. They are not historical facts. They are much more emotional rendering than factual necessarily. So those elements were very interesting to me, and we can move on to the next slide, please. And we cross-pollinate a lot our research in the Heavy Water Collective. So Jo passed on to me a book that she thought might very much interest me, and she was very true. It was a book that was simply talking about villages of Flanders. And we can move on to the next slide, please. So Flanders is, I think in most Europeans' mind, is associated with the First World War. And a few months before our arrival, the start of our residency at G39, Russia declared war on Ukraine. And for this reason, I felt that I needed to work with war. My work is very much influenced by narration and narratives and storytelling, as mentioned before, but it's also a reaction to current events. And I don't have the capacity, or it is not my job, I feel, to talk about current events, but I'm much more interested in my emotional reactions to what's going on in the world now. So I had letters to start with. I had a wonderful book that's about Flanders, and also the special collection hosts a vast array of archival material from propaganda images and propaganda material from Russia. So all of these elements collided into narrowing down my research at the special collections. And we can move on to the next slide, please. This is another example of letters, and it's a wonderful book called Letters of Aberland and Eloise. And I also love the design of the book. So I often work with difficult subjects, but for me it's very important also to make sure that I entice the viewer into coming along with me on a journey that might be quite difficult. So the way things look and the way and attention to detail is very important to me in the presentation of the work. And this book very much represented that. It's a love story written in letters. It's beautifully crafted, but it's also romantic in the sense that it ends very badly. So this book represented a lot of emotions or intention that I also wanted to represent in my work. We can move on to the next slide, please. And in parallel to the residency, I was commissioned by Montes Press Radio to create a podcast on sustainability. And I thought that the research residency at G39 was the perfect opportunity to make this podcast. So I spent some time talking to Victoria, Joanna, Anthony, and Sara. And we all reflected upon sustainability in the art sector. And we can move on to the next slide, please. And finally, this is one image that documents an event that we did at the end of our residency. So at the end of the residency, we presented our work in progress to members of the public. And this is simply an image that documents that event. And we can move on to the next slide, please. And this is your turn, Vic.
Okay, so in this section, we're going to look more closely at the processes undertaken since the residency to make artworks in response to the artifacts we each encountered in the residency in Cardiff. And with the support of Pitt as well, we had tutorials as part of the project with Pitt over Zoom. Yeah, we'll talk about the structure, the process. So I start with the object first off. This beautifully crafted book with its sumptuous binding, intricate marbled end pages, and pull-out illustrations was published in 1773. And for context, in the year that this book was published, tens of thousands would be murdered as part of the ongoing witch trials lawfully practiced across Europe. And millions of African men, women, and children were being forced onto slave ships, and transported across the Atlantic. The Enclosures Act was passed in the UK, and that enabled the enclosure of land while at the same time removing the right of commoners' access, and that rendered large swathes of the population destitute. And British imperialism continued to power abhorrent colonial practices across the globe. So it was a monstrous time in which patriarchal colonialism, with its constellation of inequalities and determined power dynamics, was firmly rooted. And it was the beginnings of a system that continues to fuel inequality and injustices today. There are three particular fold-out images from the book that I've worked with to develop the response to this object. And the first depicts Chieftain Perea and her Tahitian community surrendering to Captain Samuel Wallis, who anchored in Matavai Bay in 1767 and claimed the island in the name of King George III, to whom the book has been addressed. And I find this image really unsettling. So on the right, you have a group of men in their finery, and they stand half with their backs to the viewer in this supposed moment of peaceful surrender to Captain Wallis. And on the left-hand side of the image, we see a large group of men, women, and children bowing uncomfortably behind Chieftain Perea as she submits their lands to the strangers. And before this moment of surrender, the Western account is that the indigenous tribe took to their canoes and tried to take the ship and beach it. In what they describe as a retaliation, the English sailors opened fire on the canoes and the crowds situated on the surrounding hillsides. And in this image, we can see cannon fire and plumes of smoke, which is, a highly violent retaliation that was essentially a method of domination and control. Finally, this image supposedly documents the conversations that took place between Commodore Byron and the indigenous people of Patagonia on a subsequent journey on the same ship, the Dolphin, to the southern hemisphere. And there were rumors of Patagonian giants at this time, which originated from the 15th century from a previous expedition, and that likely influenced the scale of the figures in this image. But yeah, I'm drawn to the turbulence of this time as a moment in history that ripples out and reaches us today through our ancestry and through so many ongoing intersectional inequalities and injustices today. And the archive holds a multitude of objects, or archives in general, that provide further insights into these often distorted histories. And as a heavy water artist, I believe it's of vital importance to engage with these accounts rather than to hide them away, and create responses to them rather than just illustrate their content and perpetuate the myths. And open up a space as well for learning through these artworks to ultimately encourage opportunities for societal change. And I really believe that we have to understand the past in order to reinvent the future through creative imagination. And that's why art is so important. Creating something methodologically ritualistic in response to these images that were found in the recesses of the landmass upon which I was born became a real focus. And through experimentation, the light of the domestic scanner combined with the ritualized movements using the hands revealed new ways of thinking and seeing through the thickness of time. These distortions resulted in the facial expressions of the colonizers becoming central. as they gaze out through the digital folds created by my body working with technology, working with the scanner. And you know, in these images we see huddles of men looking in all directions, and they're seemingly plotting their next move, and their bodies bulge out of the page and the absences appear in return, and their space is created over time through light, movement and sensors. As an artist, I often see and experience through technology, and in turn the technology sees and experiences through both me and the data we collect together. Through my artistic practice, technology has become a cyborgian extension of my direct bodily engagement with my environment and with the histories contained within it. The glitchy space that this method opens up reveals a landscape of injustice in which we can find ravines, sinkholes, earthquakes, volcanoes, quarries and swathes of absence. It also provides a place for the discovery of unspoken truths, speculative fictions and new futures. Pushing the boundaries of the image in this way enables a playful deconstruction and reconstitution without shying away from the brutalities that the image represents. The final series of images will be framed and exhibited in the same format as a traditional etching, so that the original context is referenced. These glitched visualizations disrupt power dynamics, subvert narratives, agitate truths, and create opportunities for rereadings. If we look through the lens of Legacy Russell's Glitch Feminism Manifesto, these works seemingly dissent against capitalism. As Russell states, the glitch creates fissures within which new possibilities of being and becoming manifest. The images are purposeful, destabilizing errors, and through their distortions, the ugly truths of history are laid bare. And here are some close-ups of each of those 5 images. In this one, the relationship between the 2 central figures is forever bound in history. And interestingly, Captain Wallace mistakenly assumed that Chieftain Perea was the queen of all Tahiti rather than the chief of her tribe. And this sort of digital positioning that takes place through using the scanner represents or refers to these clumsy assumptions and opens out a space to consider the subject of ownership through their locked gaze and through the power dynamics that become fluid through the representations in the digital terrain created. And in this image, we see agitations of the meeting between Commodore Byron and the Teulchi people. Yeah, and there's some really abhorrent accounts of abductions in which Teulchi families were taken by European explorers to be exhibited in circuses across Europe in the second half of the 19th century. So the weight of this image is far heavier than just you know, what seems like a simple conversation with the crew of a passing ship, as this broken image seeks to reveal. So through the interrogation of this object, new works have been developed that destabilize its content in a contemporary context. As massive Western corporations continue to destroy communities and their ancestral lands in the pursuit of wealth from natural resources such as water, mining and agriculture, I ask how much has actually changed. Through the fissures of the glitch, we see the stark repetition of history and ask for creative solutions in the context of the resulting ecological crisis. In collaboration with technology itself, a product of the mining industry, I work with its geology to deconstruct the systemic forces that have sought to destabilize the human and more than human majority. I'll move on to Jo. Thank you.
Right, that's me. So ambiguous witnesses. I'll take you through my processes, Vic, if you want to move on. So, as I say, when I was at the archive, when I was gathering sources, I was looking at this scrapbook from 1819 to 1890. So these gathered images of romantic ruins, these kind of beautiful abbeys, and I was thinking about, you know, landscape and what that means in these kind of destruction, and comparing these with these images from Paul Nash, you know, one of the most famous painters of this period, depicting war. And the way I make my paintings and the way I draw is to combine sources. So in this regard, I was combining these images from Paul Nash with these bucolic scenes and this idea of the ruin, the idea of matter emerging, re-emerging, falling, emerging, and temporality and time. And I think it's that pace through the landscape, the rise and fall within landscape, and that kind of reflection of destruction. And I think, interestingly, working with sources as a painter, and using something which is, a traditional method that's been around forever, you're kind of authenticating these sources, authenticating these almost collaged imaginings. And it's also the time in the making, drawing and painting something into reality in which it becomes almost factual, a factual reflection. Next, please. And these are the kind of images I was looking at in these war photography magazines, and thinking of them formally again as a landscape painter in terms of landscape. I've used snow a lot in my paintings in the past, and snow has this kind of visual onomatopoeia, if that's possible, whereas snow becomes like paint. And I've always been interested and fascinated that you can have a tube of white paint and a handful of snow, and there's this kind of analogous feeling between them, this blanketing. And snow is this kind of silencer and something that mutes and covers and conceals. So you're looking at these worn and torn images and these kind of layers of snow, and knowing how cold and awful the whole business would have been, and yet this sort of gently kind of smothering and layering of snow. And then you had this idea of no man's land, of course, and these ravaged and destroyed landscapes. And again, going back to Nash and those paintings that he made, and this kind of fissure in the earth. And I'm, thinking again of that cleaving, thinking of the earth opening, and going back to, accounts of devils emerging from the earth, and bringing these two things together. And finally, the forest, which appears repeatedly in my work. And there were so many sources and imagery of people, battles and skirmishes taking part in forests. And there's something about the forest that becomes this kind of very transgressive space, this space with repetition of tree after tree, a space where you can get lost, but also that kind of moves throughout history. So you think of, it feels like you can be looking at a battle on one side and you turn to the left to see the horned god, or all of these mythological creatures. And again, in these texts of witchcraft, witches often meet the devil in the woods and he kisses them and they become his servant. So it's kind of all of these spaces of landscape. And in everything I do, and in everything we do, in all of these things, landscape is the backdrop, but also a protagonist. Next slide, please. Again, so just looking quickly at another layered drawing. So that's Bunyan's tomb, which appears at the end of his text, which was reprinted and reprinted and reprinted. It was very successful, and mixing them with these scrapbook images, but making the landscape the object of mourning. So, combining these bucolic forests and wood and the kind of complete destruction and annihilation, not only of humanity, but also of landscape. So looking at these millhead bone drawings of, again, this devastation in no man's land of trees. So again, exploring everything through drawing. Next slide, please, Vic. So as I was starting to look at these two different sources, I was looking again at a book that has kind of ticked through my practice and pulsed. And it's the Master and Margarita, Mikhail Bulgakov, written during Stalin's time. It wasn't actually published until 1967. It was considered as a subversive novel. And I'm really thinking of a hinge. So when you're looking at books, when you're looking at history, these moments where something comes apart, but there's a kind of folding. And this text looks at a period when the devil comes to kind of communist Russia. It kind of emerges from thin air. And at the same time, there's a conversation in the book going on between Pontius Pilate and Jesus that's very slow and meditative and intersects the book. So I was really looking at that in terms of the sources I was looking at, but also the work I began to make, looking at this idea of a mirroring and two narratives running concurrently. Next, please, Vic. So I started to link up sources, and a lot of the time in my work I've done with collections, I'm kind of pulling together narratives that are seemingly made out of varied and a variety of sources, which, you know, arguably religions do, political ideology does. So we're going back to that original medieval Reformation text, you know, where the papist king and his family are devoured by rats, and then these rats emerging in the trenches, these harbingers that move between worlds and move through thin air, like Bulgakov's Devil. Next, please. And again, here's just another repetition, the devil pulling a woman from a dinner table, and she becomes a shape. She becomes this kind of strange upside down shape, and the twisting of the devil. And I was linking this again. This is an image of a building falling as it's destroyed. So it started to fall and it's paused. I can't see it very well because my face is in the way, but it's this idea of a static shape, a new shape, a shape that can only exist of this time, a shape that you can't understand, and the blackness of that shape, and it starts to intersect between time. It's this kind of shape-shifting shape. Next, please. And again, looking for these figures, here's another figure who walks away, you know, this kind of banality of destruction, you know, people strolling through a destroyed city. And yet here's this figure emerging, and who is he and why is he emerging unnoticed? And it's this triangle silhouette, this shape that's not a human shape. So just looking for these new kind of harbingers, these shapeshifters, these people that move between times and starting to unfurl and create a narrative from this. Next, please, Vic. So this is, then I spoke to Pitt. We had our tutorial, and Pitt was talking to me. I was trying to explain this idea of the shapes and the shapeshifters and different shapes from these images. And he was talking to me about Kipfiguren, and sorry, Pitt, for my pronunciation. But as he was talking, he was going, you know, they lean, you know, and I was thinking about leaning figures and leaning and moving and shifting. And really the ambiguous figure means, you know, it's a figure where two realities exist at the same time, two things exist at the same time. So this is a really famous image where the rabbit becomes the duck, becomes the rabbit, you know, neither wins, they exist at the same time. So thinking about this in terms of the images I was looking at. Thank you, Pitt, for that. It really inspired me. Next. So again, here's another figure I was looking at. This is a stuffed figure that was just used for target practice or bayonet practice. But you can see this other figure in front of them, these strange emerging figures that sort of make no sense. And they're really, you know, you kind of look again and you don't always immediately understand what they are. And as a painter, beginning to paint them in the way that one paints landscape, it kind of gives them a reality and an authenticity because they become part of a cultural language, and that cultural language of painting. So it's already starting to embed something into a reality and into a narrative. Next slide, please, Vic. So then, you know, and once you start to do that, it's like, how do you make narratives and they unfurl and they keep moving? So looking through images, studying images, and this is a woman looking at a destroyed church. But if in a new narrative, she's looking at a symbol on a wall, which can be a doorway to somewhere else. And perhaps, you know, this is where shapeshifters move. It's a time passage and all of these mythologies that start. So studying these photos was really fascinating for me because you're just looking, you start with a narrative confirmation bias. You know how they do it. The police have when they're looking for a suspect, you have a confirmation bias. So you start to look for something and then you find it. Next. And this is the final figure I'm looking at. I'm trying to keep to time. So this is a lady who was dealing with people who'd been gassed, and obviously she's covered, but it's this strange figure that's still amongst this kind of chaos and smoke and dust, and she seems to be looking, she seems static, she's faceless, and she becomes a kind of a kind of figure, a sentinel, a witness, a repeated motive, a motive that could repeat, looking at the stylized structure of her outfit and her stance. Next, please, Vic. So this might take a little bit to render. It is on my computer, but this is a painting I'm working on. It's still in progress. But it's looking at these shrines that I make. I make these shrines, and they're made in the forest because they become of the forest, that they're constructed from the forest, and everything that I've spoken about, the forest and snow and this kind of muffling muteness of snow. But again, thinking about narrative and the motive repeating, and how once something is repeated enough, it becomes authenticated. Once it's repeated in a painting, on a plate, on a cup. And here she is again, the witness. And this is a design from a medieval communion vessel, and she appears again. So it's repetition and authentication. And I found that really interesting when working with collections and looking at collections of how one authenticates a narrative, how one invents a narrative, and the methods through which you authenticate it and make it factual. And I think that's me, and I hope it gets to time.
Well, there's a challenge for me to follow. First of all, I would like to say a huge hi, a huge thank you to Jo and Vic for their presentation, but also hi to Sara, who I can see in the chat is clapping, so she has seen the presentation and is enjoying them. Sara, it's up to you, but if you want, you can turn off your video and become a full member of our crew this evening, if it's something you want to do. I'm going to introduce the work that I've created because of the residency at G39. And as mentioned before, I was looking at letters at the special collection and archives, at the special collections at Cardiff University. And through this research, I decided to particularly focus on letters written by soldiers during the First World War or after the First World War. And we can move on to the next slide, thanks. So these are other examples of letters, and I kind of rewrote a little bit the letters that I found. So it was a very difficult process for me because I did not want to denature the letters. I really very much wanted to keep their strong testimony, their strong documentary purpose. But I also wanted to highlight the emotional cost of war. And what was also very interesting for me was that I wanted to find a way to make sure that the letters were anonymous, atemporal, and that they cannot be located specifically. So I did not want to start talking about one specific war because I don't think I have the knowledge to do that. But also as a visual artist, it's very important for me to create a greater story, or to try to tap into very much for me in that work, in the emotional cost of war and in the cost of war on a human level. So we can move on to the next slide, please. This is an image that I fell in love with when I saw it as part of Russian archival material. So I knew that I wanted to include some of those images in the work. And we can move on to the next slide, please. So it was tricky for me to include images of Russia within the work because I did not want to myself start to create propaganda material through my work. So this idea of keeping things atemporal was very important. But the best way I could do it and the best way I could create work that was both atemporal and without any strict geographical location, was to mix the variety of source. So I mixed as much sources as possible in order to lose the trace of a specific location. And what I also find particularly interesting in the archival materials that I found, the Russian archival materials that I found, is that they were labeled at the special collection as being propaganda material. And there were also very much images of tourism and touristic brochure. And it's something that I've worked on before, the link between the link between exploitation and tourism, the link between tourism material, touristic material, and the link between propaganda. So here it was served to me on a plate at the archival collection. I had this exact document in front of me. But another aspect that is absolutely fascinating in those materials is the attention to detail and the wonderful design that's all of this material was encompassing. So on the design level, it was extraordinary. And it was very good to move on to the next slide. Excellent choice. This is another archival image from Russia. And as mentioned before, the subject that I was looking at were difficult and complex, and it's very important for me to entice the viewer in the difficult narrative that I'm trying to express in my work. And we can move on to the next slide, please. So this idea of careful design and careful presentation is important. And those are other examples of so-called propaganda material, Russian propaganda archival materials. And what particularly interested me is the kind of block printing, which I'd already looked at in a book that I mentioned earlier today, The Letters of Aberold and Eloise. But the mixture of color and black and white as a way to really draw the eye onto specific images. So this is something I've developed in my work. And yeah, we can move on to the next slide. This is another example of a wonderful little pamphlet, Russian pamphlet, mixing color, black and white, very simple drone design with photography. And it's something that we will see later I've used. Those are postcards of Russia. And working with postcard is a device that I've used in my work previously. And I was very interested in trying to redo this, but in a different manner. So I was interested in working with postcard again, but for somehow very different reason. What interests me with postcard is that they are images that they are objects that we normally associate with holidays and with very pleasurable time. And to use them in conjunction with letters from the war was creating a dynamic that interested me in the sense that they force a kind of tension and they force a tension between what we hear and what we see. And this is something that I was interested in. And we can move on to the next slide. It's the fourth edit of the video that I've made in Cardiff. So I'm at my fourth edit of that video work. And the first edit that I showed to Anthony and Pete was an edit where I used nearly exclusively images found at the special collections in Cardiff. And I narrated myself the letters from the soldier. And I felt that it wasn't appropriate for this work because it was narrowing it down too much, mainly because of my very strong accent, and it was adding meaning that I didn't think was necessarily, or it was kind of confusing, I think. So I wanted something a lot plainer and a lot more distanciated. So I've invited actors to read the letters for me. So in the final edit that I'm going to show you, I'm finally not speaking those letters. I'm not saying those letters anymore. So we can move on to the next slide. So as mentioned before, I'm using postcards in the video work that I'm going to show you in a few minutes. And the postcard that I'm using have been highly reworked. So I do a lot of image manipulation with my work. And this photos, for example, is an image of the border between France and Belgium. And behind those trees was a huge cathedral, and I erased the cathedral just to bring, because as I hope as you will see, I think it fits better with the nature of the letter. So what the nature of using archival material and to then transform them, I think is a problematic practice. But it's also one that I fully justify by the means that it allows me to bizarrely, and I hope I'm not going to be too provocative when I'm saying that, but bizarrely, I think that they document, they become greater documents somehow. The relation between the letter, what is being read, and the image forces the brain, I think, and forces the viewer to always create connections between what is being heard and what is being seen. And it's through these connections, I think, through this tension between what is heard and what is seen, that there is an increased visibility, or there is an increased emotional access to what should actually be some very simple travel images. They become something else. They become part of this narration of trauma. And so I it's not that I denature the documents, is that it's closer to a form of denaturation of the postcard, or changing the stages that the postcard might have. And if that's okay with you, Vic, we can perhaps watch the video work. In the chat, I've just added a link, a YouTube link, so you can copy this link and watch the video in your own time after the talk, if you want to do so. Because we're going to watch the video via Zoom right now. And unfortunately, it often, the viewing is often not very good via Zoom. So I hope you'll get an idea of the video work. And I hope it won't be too bad via Zoom. Thank you.
We were in the first attack. I was wounded myself. There was very few of us left. I could give a lot more details, but I am not enough of a scholar to put them into words. I also want to mention that what was left of us was transferred to the 13th Battalion, and I am sorry to say that later I was prisoner of war.
Dear Sir, your inquiry reopened a wound which I have never forgotten, for my fiancé laid down his life on the field near the woods on July 10th. He was to have come home for our marriage, but leave was cancelled on July 1st. He was native of the village from where I am writing this letter, and had only been overseas for 7 months and was due for his first leave. If you are writing a book, I hope that in some pages his name may be mentioned as a brave man, whom I found most worthy to be loved.
I am writing this letter on behalf of my father, who was in the battle beyond the woods. This is his account. We attacked at 4 a.m. on July 10th. We were led by our lieutenant, whose last words before dying were, "Don't forget whom you belong to." He was the first man to be killed, shot through the head. We penetrated approximately halfway into the wood, suffering heavy casualties. Eventually we were relieved by the 12th Division. Our heaviest casualties were suffered in the dipped field leading to the woods. I have heard my father recount this story before, and when I told him about you, he was eager to give this information, which he hopes will be useful to you. Even from this distance in time, the account of killing and maiming during this conflict makes one wince physically with horror.
Okay, so thanks, Maud. So I guess now we would like to just open the session out to questions, comments. I don't know if Anthony and Pip would like to say something as well at this point.
And it would be lovely to hear from Sara if you felt like introducing yourself and saying hello.
Hi there, everybody. I am absolutely mortified. I've never felt Brexiteer in my life. This is what happens when we work on an international project and you misread the European time zone. So I was very smug thinking I was early, so my apologies. I just want to thank all of you, not only the project partners for being so generous in enabling this to happen, but the three of you as a collective for engaging with our collections so thoughtfully and so respectfully, and in a way that kind of challenges the basis for that respect as well, so that that idea of approaching fictions, apparitions, you know, threads that we as archive professionals might not see, and that the academics who are our bread and butter might not be following either. So I really wanted to thank you for the quality of attention that you gave our collection, and for producing such insightful, exciting work, and for showing what can be possible when we kind of try and bridge that gap between practicing artists and ourselves as information professionals, as archive professionals. We get the pleasure and the privilege of rummaging in our collections, of using our instinct, of having to look to see what might be in this box, or even to follow a gut feeling through the stacks. You're faced with a digital catalogue that you have to use keyword searches on. And so it's kind of trying to find a way to meet in the middle and to offer that instinctive, more creative experience to you. And I'm really, really glad that you graced us with your presence, and I hope that we'll be able to work together again. So thank you, and my apologies for misreading the time zones. I am, as I said, completely mortified.
No, it's really lovely to see you, Sara. Thank you very much.
I might chip in because I started off with Zoom awkwardness earlier, but I've been thinking about the whole process and why it was unique at G39, I think, because we've often hosted artists and we're always keen that to emphasize that artwork in galleries doesn't land fully formed in white rooms. It grows from somewhere, and the residency was the opportunity to kind of see that in action in quite an intense, short amount of time. And then there's a few things I've been thinking about, and then you've said words that have prompted me to kind of bring them to the fore. And this is one of those ones where I'm not going to say this isn't exactly a question. These are things I've been thinking about in terms of my practice that I think might land quite well with some of the things you've said. So I've been reading, connecting some bits. So recently I was reading Stolen Focus, which is about kind of how our focus is scattered across lots of things. And one of the chapters is about how empathy is developed, empathy develops quicker in fiction than it does in non-fiction in one study. And then I was thinking about what artists do in archives, because and Sara, this is wholly subjective, so you can tell me I'm totally wrong, but I wondered whether artists arriving at artifacts, arriving at archive material, are freed from the obligation of proving something or illustrating something, and are able to actually go through that archive to develop new narratives and new fictions. So I think all three of you used the phrase pulling together narratives in what you've just said. And I wondered, through that process, it allows us as witnesses of it and yourselves to increase our sense of empathy with the archive itself. So that was one thing that was rattling around. And then just as you said it, and this comes from Pitt, the Kip figure N, where something is two things at the same time. So that also chimed with this idea that this kind of, I think of it like artists are sort of allowed to skim stones through archives and like not have the weight of academic responsibility necessarily, but have ways of actually pulling connections. But the idea of those two things existing at the same time, so a new fiction over artifacts, over research. So not a question, but things that I've been carrying around that when I've been thinking about your work have been at the forefront of my mind.
Well, it's so.
Yeah, maybe I could add something that is more or less stressing your point, because I found that the kind of work you brought to let us see in this presentation gives somehow the connection between the historical approach of the material to the present. So it makes like if it's the glitch between time, which makes time kind of fluid, gives in a narrative way that is not really academic. It's the opposite of that. It's a very free, because art is free, you know. So the approach and the attack to the material is a very free associative thing, and goes from the visual ways, and at the same time it gives it a new kind of actuality. So that is kind of reenacting the archives, or real life of the archive. That's what I found intriguing while watching this process, more or less. And to add two things concerning the organizations taking part in this, I would stress that I was thinking of two aspects that had been mixed, more or less. The one is the residency, and the kind of residency combined with an archive, and the other is the collaboration. So that's so maybe even three things combined, and that was gave me the idea to somehow think it over and give new ideas for the future for our organization as well. So this had kind of an example, or like a kick to think about doing things like that. Yeah? Because we hosted guests all the time for a long time, and the hosting itself to make possible everything the people visiting us is one of our main goals, but the combination with other institutions and maybe even cross-founding then was something I thought one should in the future think at the Kunstlerhaus itself. And so the artworks themselves were like the beginning of a process at our house as well. So that's what, thank you for that.
Well, yeah, it's wonderful. It's really wonderful to hear that, you know, our project didn't only serve us. You know, it would have been quite problematic for all of us if it had been the case. We often do things in isolation, but to know that they have an impact that goes far beyond what we had expected is also yeah, very wonderful. And Anthony, I also wanted to thank you. I hope that for our auditors, it's not like we're hugging each other all the time. But you phrased something much better than what I wanted to phrase towards the end of my presentation, is this idea that to create narrative and sometimes transform or play with facts in order to tell the story is about, for me, and I think it is also very much the case in Jo's and Victoria's work, a way to bring empathy. And it's what I was trying to phrase by taking the viewer with me on a journey that might be a difficult one, but it's echoing and creating those kind of emotions that connect us to the rest of humanity and somehow.
Sara, I was going to ask, has there ever been an artist in the collection who you've just gone, no, you're too reckless. Your empathy's not there?
I can't think of an artist. There was a poet who came in once and I couldn't tell if he was half cut or not. But he was carrying a very large wooden staff and he wanted to select the books and the readings he was going to do by swinging around with said wooden staff in his hand. And we do have quite a lot of open glass shelving in the room. And yeah, it was one of those things where, you know, you invite new audiences into the archive, you have to roll with the punches or the sticks in this case. Yeah. But yeah, no, it's been fantastic to hear your reflections, and I think that's exactly it. A lot of our aims is to be a catalyst for the production of new work, so that what is that we are stewards of kind of lives beyond our walls. That's part of culture that's discussed, unpicked, you know, made fun of, remixed, copied, whatever it is. And it's through this kind of engagement, this real quality of engagement that starts to happen, and these connections as well between organizations and also just people going, do you know what, I'm going to work with my local archive. I'm going to cross the threshold and just see what they've got and just ask. And that's all part of why we do this kind of what we call civic engagement, which is working with people outside of academia with much more fun results, I'm going to say. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I wonder, sorry, Maud.
We've got a question from Peter, and I want to say hi, Peter. Peter from PS Square in Belfast. Peter is asking us, you, Jo, Vic, and myself, if we can spell out what benefits we see in being a collective, and what it enables us to do, which we wouldn't be able to do on our own. Thanks for this question, Peter.
I can start. Well, I think we've all said that working together as part of a collective has created a support network. So we all have studios at Block. We all have doors in our studios, and so, you know, a lot of the time we're working alone, and working as a collective means that we spend a lot more time in each other's studios looking at work, having informal crits, discussing shared interests, and so it becomes a real a kind of network, really. Yeah, I mean, there's loads more I could say, but I'll maybe pass on to Maud.
Yeah, I mean, it's for me, it's really incredible to work as part of a collective, but it's also because I think we found Jo, Victoria, and myself work in a very similar way and with the very similar intent. So we're not scared to work as much as each other, and we really pull all our energy into the same direction, which means that when we apply for funding, when we write applications, we can share the work, and sharing the boring work of being an artist, because being an artist is also doing a lot of administrative work. Sharing this is really, really important. But as Vig was also mentioning it before, we're also critical friends, so we can show each other our work. And when it's not good enough, we tell each other with kindness, with empathy again, but we are critical friends too, and we know we can do so because we are very close friends also. So it's being as part of a collective offers emotional support, work support, and critical support, I would say. But Jo, you might want to add a lot more to this.
It's actually difficult. It's terrible. It's difficult. No, it's wonderful. And I think there's not much I can add really, apart from it's just a level of efficiency, applying for funding, doing things together, sharing tasks. We all work we have a really similar work ethic. So is a kind of a real equivalency. We become really efficient, and more efficient than I would work on my own, where I might kind of procrastinate slightly. But when we're together, we kind of galvanize that, and which I find really interesting. And also where we look at the connections together, and where we cross over, and where we, meet each other, and where our work meets. It also kind of galvanizes your own practice as well. So the differences are the strengths as well. So you can see how work from a different viewpoint, a different way of making, communicates in this kind of open dialogue with the other work. So there's a kind of, it was really surprising when it occurred, when we first showed together at Site Gallery, because it just emerged really beautifully out of nowhere and just formed itself really easily and quickly, and as if it just was as it should be.
Okay, I've got the questions for our guests then. So Pete very kindly shared with us how our collective have helped in find new ideas for development of work. I was wondering if you, Anthony and Sara, if our collective has also given you ideas, or if it has helped you in many ways to have us around and to be our host during the
Anthony, I was going to ask if you wanted to go. I'm happy to answer. I think there's a lot for us to reflect on in terms of working practices. I know that there are a lot of artists who want to quote unquote engage with the archive. But when it comes to kind of rolling up your sleeves and seeing what that means and what that feels like, sometimes we don't meet expectations. Sometimes we're a bit more boring, or sometimes we're a bit more kind of administrative or bureaucratic than you expect. And that spark takes a little bit of work to get to. So it's a kind of a question for me is how we support artists to gain confidence, gain skills, get over the threshold fear, and also to acknowledge that not every single thing you're going to find in an archive is going to be like top mint gemstone of a thing, and that there is a kind of trudge to it, but that there's a joy in that as well. It's so I think that's the main thing for us is continuing on this path of finding a way of creating an archival experience for artists that does catalyze new work and gives you something of value and makes you glad that you engaged with us.
I think with here, it really strengthened a kind of belief I've got where rather than, if you look at all the resources available to you, like, so for G39, we're like cash poor, but we've got a space and equipment and a library and a cinema and a car park that we can put a table in. Just looking at how those resources can enable projects like this to happen is a real kind of, I think for me, it's like, well, how do I stop gatekeeping those resources? How do I make people know these are here? I guess similar to you, Sara, where you go, where we're not trying to gatekeep things or stop people getting there, but communicating what those things are sometimes is an extra thing that you need to do so that people understand that these things are accessible and are usable. So that's been a real lesson, is, you know, you three in the library for a week with lunches produced this incredible body of work, and that's what it needed. That's what it needed from us to happen. Yeah.
I wonder if we
few-
should, I wonder if we should open it out to more questions from the audience. Yeah, please let us know by just speaking or putting your hand up.
And Pete, I know that you had prepared a lot more to talk to us about. I don't know if it's something that I don't want you to feel that we've cut your presentation short, or I don't know if you want to tell us more about Kunslterhaüs, or it's very much up to you at this stage. I don't think that we will have many more questions from the public, and we are 5 minutes. We're 5 minutes ahead of our end time. So I don't know if you want to present anything. Alternatively, we can also, you know, there's no obligation.
Yeah, this is not. It was just because I wasn't sure about the proceedings in the meeting, so I prepared like a report what we do with some images, but that's all on our website, so it's easy to see. And it's just because I was thinking about the combination of structures and thinking of programs in the Kunslterhaüs, and so if that would have been an issue, that would be helpful to first have seen that, but that's not the case now, so that's okay with me. Yeah. In fact, I have really, just like Jens has, a meeting afterwards. So for me, it's completely okay. I just wanted to say thank you for the wonderful work and for the outcome. And I had the privilege to talk with you while it was developed. So that was a great experience to see what finally was your way out of the archive and into the world with the works now. Thank you.
It definitely was for us to really lovely to have conversation with you, Pete. So thank you very much for that too.
You're welcome.
I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for being involved in this project. This is the final event really of the Four Nations funded project, but obviously we will be continuing to make work. We have so much material to sort of engage with still. You know, I think the objects from the archive will seep into works for some time to come. Yeah, I really hope that we can all stay in touch. We'll be sending you updates, I'm sure. But yeah, thank you so much for all of your contributions and support over the past year. maybe. Yeah.
And I've just posted in the chat the web link to G39, Kunslterhaüs Dortmund, and the special collections at Cardiff University. So if members of the public want to have a member of the audience, sorry, want to have a look at them, they can access them from the chats. And I think we're going to close this event then, yeah. Thank you so very much for being with us this evening, all of you. And yeah, there's been a great project, as Vic mentioned. It's the end of a year-long project, so we're all a bit emotional. Thank you. Thank you.
And I'd like
so
to third
much.
it too, and all the conversations, Pit obviously with the Kip figurine, which have moved through my work. That was, you know, a highlight, but it's been brilliant. And Sara, some of your recommendations were really kind of brought a kind of emergence as well. So it's been brilliant working with all of you, and Anthony to being such a generous host to us. Thank you so much, everyone.
Shall we leave? Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Goodbye. And here we are.
Is Liam? Oh, there we are. I am
Yeah,
so
I've
sorry.
just
I'm
removed it.
so
Just
sorry.
removed it.
Don't worry. No, honestly, don't worry. I did this in my tutorial with Pit. I just didn't turn up at the right time because I got it all muddled up in my head. So you're not the only one.
It was just one of those like, well, I'll be really early at 22. I'm so sorry for interrupting, Joe.
No.
Oh, but I'm glad it's been recorded so I can catch up from the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah,
by the way,
it was lovely to